Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. This is Lori Smith of Blog Talk Radio. It is Thursday morning, 6 o'clock here in the morning, Calgary, Alberta, and April the 14th. I'm happy to be here. This is One Child Abuse Survivor to Another. We're on for 30 minutes. It's a live internet streaming radio broadcast from blogtalkradio.com, and chat room is open if anybody would like to sit in there and hang out. I'm glad to be able to do these shows and continue, just being a voice out here. We're talking about child abuse and child abuse prevention and doing this show in the morning, which is mainly my healing journey. So I appreciate everybody who's tuning in, taking the time to tune in. I almost have 24,000 shows to listen to, and I think that's a lot of shows. I just appreciate everybody who's taking the time to listen. And, I'm not a counselor or therapist, and I'm just a private citizen paying to do my shows, and that's just because I want to be one more voice to add to all the other voices out here who are speaking out against abuse and standing up for child rights and the protection of children. And for survivors, there's so many survivors of child abuse who, whether they ever get any help or not is an issue. And so many people feel so isolated. And I know myself, that's how I felt about prior to my healing journey, which was about 4 years ago. So coming right up on 4 years now. And so, I just want to be one more voice and also, talk about the issues that many adult survivors have to go through. And as I look through the material and I'm researching for my own healing journey, I'll find things that I think are, that I relate to and that sort of did have a profound effect on my well-being, my emotional well-being, psychological well-being, physical well-being. And so, I just like to bring this information out to people. So you have to listen to at your own discretion to all of my shows, because I'm talking about abuse, and abuse is a very sensitive subject, and a lot of people may have not heard a lot about abuse. If you have not, if you were not abused yourself and you don't know anybody you don't really think you might know anybody who's been abused, this information can be quite disturbing. And so you have to really listen at your own discretion and know what's good for you to listen to. I know the topics of abuse don't bother me because I grew up like this. This is my life. This is what I experienced. And, as damaging and horrific as it was, I just don't, it doesn't bother me to talk about it because I was forced to endure it as a child and have to be a part of it and play this role and live and exist within it. So it doesn't bother me to talk about it. So, but I know for a lot of people it is kind of hard for them to listen to this stuff because just from watching movies, you can see people's reactions from movies where there's domestic violence and abuse and possibly child abuse and different types of movies that are out there. And you can see the general reaction from the public is one of, that it's upsetting to people. And most people, because it's a movie, they're okay with it. But when you hear about real life stories, sometimes it's a little distressing. So that's why I ask everybody to listen at your own discretion. And young people under the age of 18, I just ask that you have someone listen to the show with you, an adult who's older who can help you make the decision whether you should be listening and whether or not the material is something you should be listening to and, age appropriately, right? So thanks, everybody, for being here. This week I was just kind of looking into unwantedness because, that's sort of something my inner child and my inner self is still searching for some comfort and relief, from growing up knowing that I was unwanted. And, a lot of, like I was talking about, like Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, so many people, adult survivors of child abuse and just people in general can probably relate to this, So many times parents won't even, it's not that their parents or caregivers even tell them that they're unwanted. They just, through their actions, through what they do, through their actions and the way they treat the child, rejection or, telling the child that they're in the way or they're just a problem for them or they're, whatever. It can cause a serious problems with people who may feel unwanted or rejected by a parent or caregiver, somebody who's looking after them, who's supposed to be there to support them. And it's really bad when your parents tell you that you're not wanted, or a parent, actually spells it out for you. And then I can imagine, because my parents did not give us up for adoption, so, I know lots of people out there who have, been given up for adoption and may have to struggle with that. I can imagine so many would sit there and think, my very person who brought me into the world gave me up, and I think that must be hard. I mean, I know I experienced something similar, even though I was still stuck with my parents. And I used to kind of think maybe it would have been better if they had given us up, and now I really think it would have been better. But it's just this feeling of, wow, rejection, not being wanted. And so I was looking at articles about unwantedness and to do with child abuse. Thanks everybody for being here. I have a lot of my friends are here this morning. I have Chris and Gypsy Witch here with me this morning, and that's awesome. Thanks for being here. I hope you guys are okay and things all right there. And glad to see you. So this particular article is from, I'll pop this into the chat room actually, messengers2.com, and it's mainly talking about the issues of whether a child was wanted or unwanted. They did some studies and they looked into it, and they found that there didn't seem to be a difference between whether a child was wanted or unwanted in regards to child abuse, because unwanted children were abused, and also children who were wanted during the pregnancy, and also that they were planned pregnancies, that these children were wanted and they were still abused. So it doesn't seem to actually, the studies that they did at the time didn't seem to make a difference. And that this article just brought out a few things that I thought would be interesting to look at. There's not a whole lot out there. I was looking for unwantedness, unloved, articles about abuse, and there was only a handful out there, because this kind of falls under emotional, psychological abuse, right? So that's there's lots of information out there about that. But a child feeling that they're unwanted or unloved, or whether it's the actual physical, neglect or abuse of being unwanted, unloved, and rejected and pushed away, there isn't a whole lot out there just specifically talking about this. You know what I mean? It's just mainly all lumped into the emotional, psychological, or neglect, right? And so, but I did see a couple of things on this article that I thought were kind of interesting, that I thought would just bring up and talk about, because I related to some of it. And so that's what we're looking at this week. So I did pop the link in there. That's www.messengers2.com. And so yesterday we were looking at mistreatment affects the child's self-perception and her outlook on the world, and it tends to make children suicidal, pessimistic, and negative. Children who are physically abused tend to anticipate a violent death, and that's what we were talking about yesterday. And then question number 6, or point number 6, when asked, children tend to attribute mistreatment first to parental immaturity, and then to marital conflict when given a variety of choices regarding causation. So what caused the maltreatment, the mistreatment? Could be the parents' immaturity and inability to properly parent, and also marital conflict. And that's just a huge issue for children, who grow up in homes where their parents are, really don't have any coping skills and didn't learn any good proper parenting skills. And my parents that was my parents, they were both mistreated and abused as children, and were not shown how to properly raise children, right, because they were not raised properly. So they went on to have this huge family and didn't know how to cope. They didn't know how to rely on each other. There was a lot of anger and abuse between themselves, and so it sort of spilled over to the kids. And marital conflict, I think, is a huge issue in regards to children feeling comfortable and safe in the home. And growing up around a lot of domestic violence and abuse, I know what that's like. To know that your parents are not like a unit. They're not together. They're not coping together. They're not saying nice things to each other. They're just hurting each other, tearing each other down. It's hard on the family. I know lots of people experience this stuff, and I've known so many people in my lifetime who have been victims themselves firsthand of domestic violence or marital conflict, or also who are secondhand victims, which is like myself, somebody, a child of a parent or a couple who has a lot of domestic violence and abuse going on. So it's pretty harsh on the kids, to grow up around that. And they might, it just leads to really poor choices that parents will make for their children, because they're stuck in this marriage and this relationship that is not healthy for them. So it's not healthy for the children, right? And number 7, they said, when abuse is preceded by neglect, the impact is much greater. Neglect appears to make children both more susceptible and more vulnerable to mistreatment. This is stuff that they found in this study. So neglect is huge, and it's the most common form of abuse, really, and it's it's absolutely horrific, because it's the the consequences from being neglected. Neglect is it affects children physically as well as emotionally and psychologically. They're not getting their needs met, and so neglect was huge in our home. And I know we were not getting our needs met in any way. I mean, we were fed, like we were not starving, that's for sure. Like my mom fed us, but there was nobody really looking in for our well-being. Like if we got hurt, we would just remain hurt because there was nobody saying, "Oh, I better take you to the doctor," or "We better get you to the hospital." It's kind of like, no, you just deal with it and see if it heals up and if it gets better, and just that type of stuff. And they really didn't care if they were hurting us. My parents were both very abusive, and they didn't care if we were injured or not. And just this whole idea that we didn't amount to anything. We didn't count in that family, and the children just didn't matter to them. And the only time my parents would actually try to make it seem like we mattered, at all in their lives would be if they were if they were trying to use us to get back at each other, for and that happens a lot within families, and I can imagine that it does in many different families in different ways. It doesn't have to be abuse going on for that to be happening. Parents will quite often use the children against the other partner, and I've seen this like lots, just in talking to people, what I mean, and people will, even if there wasn't abuse in the home, that can still happen with children. But in my parents' case, they were always trying to make it out to be that my mom would be like, well, it's all your dad, it's all his fault, even though my mom was my main abuser. She would be blaming my dad for the whole thing. And then my dad would do the same thing with my mom. He'd be like, your mother's just crazy, and she's just, we need to leave. We need to get away from her. He would be talking about taking me to California and stuff, and I didn't want to go with him because I really didn't want to be raised by him because he was crazy, and he was also abusive towards me as well. So I none of us really, the whole family sort of basically tried to just, we had to deal with him on a daily basis, but we all tried to steer clear of him because he was absolutely insane. And so, it's harsh. And so the only attention that we were getting was really unhealthy. We never had any real family stuff going on where any kind of normal interactions with each other. So none of the siblings came together. We all sort of stayed very much separate and dysfunctional. Excuse me. And, it's pretty harsh. Like, there was no sense of a family. There was no sense of a family unit, because and that, I think that all spurs from neglect, and from, psychological abuse and just this whole issue that our parents weren't coping, and so neither the children weren't coping. So nobody was coping in our home, and I know that people go through this. It's absolutely horrific. Because later on, you can look back and see the destruction and the chaos and the dysfunction that the family went through. And most of my family's passed on. The larger portion of my family is gone, but there's a few of us left, and we're so split off, because of the lack of, we didn't really gather and bond together as a family. So even the rest of us that are left here, there's no real way for us to be a family, right? We, for a while, have, tried to, even just be able to talk in the same room together. It's almost impossible, and we're all older. Like, I'm the youngest, and so it's pretty sad to see a family destroyed like that. But that's what happens to many people, right? Number 8, abuse is not related to wantedness except in an inverse correlation. Wantedness appears to change during the pregnancy and is lowest during the first trimester. That's what they were looking at, is, taking a look at people who would be honest with their answers and during pregnancy, whether they would, whether they actually wanted the child or didn't want the child. And they seemed to find that the lowest, that the point where people would say they did not want the child would have been lowest during the first. The wantedness, like what they said, okay, I did want my child, would have been lowest in the first trimester. So, when they first find out they're pregnant, and it's like maybe it was not a want, maybe it was an unplanned pregnancy, and they're like, oh, I don't want this child, and then, but usually it changes, and they did say that later on that changes for most people, and there's only a handful of people that actually continue the thought on that the child was not wanted. And I know myself, like my mother, just talking about this, she had 7 of us actually lived, 7 children, and I'm the last of the 7. And there was 3 that were born stillborn, and who knows how many miscarriages, because my mother was, I mean, not using birth control, and she was obviously with that many kids, right? And she did not want these kids, right? Like, she did not want kids. She did not like kids. She didn't want them. She told that to my oldest sister, who's 18 years older than me, and she told that to all of her children all the way down through, that she didn't want children and that we were not wanted, and that during the pregnancy she was wishing that we would die, stuff like this, right? My mother was very, she was brutal, That's all. I mean, anybody who would tell their children that's got to be pretty brutal. I mean, even I would have appreciated like a lie coming from her. That would have made me feel a lot better. But at least I knew where I stood. It's kind of like, well, okay, at least I got the truth. But I know the truth hurts sometimes. You know what I mean? It's pretty sad when your parent tells you, that they wish you had died with the other babies that had died. That's what my mother used to tell me. And I can imagine, when she was carrying me, because I know what was going on in the family prior to my birth, right? Because of all the older siblings and all the stuff that had been going on, and getting filled in later to what was happening, before I was even born, by some of the older siblings who were still in the home. And the dysfunction and the abuse was just so harsh at that time that, my mother, when she was carrying these children, didn't want them because my dad was actually marital rape, right? He was forcing himself on her. She was not sleeping with him for years because she wasn't supposed to have any more children. She almost died after my brother was born, and that was 5 children, and who knows how many miscarriages. But she ended up having 5 more pregnancies after that, and she wasn't sleeping with my dad, so that just tells you my dad was forcing himself on her. And this was their big fight. They used to fight in the middle of the night, because my dad would be trying to force himself on her, and my mother would be like, screaming, and my older siblings would have to go and get him away from her. She didn't usually have a room. She would sleep on the couch in the living room, and because there was so many of us, right, in a small little house, right. And so when I came along, it was just the same dysfunction. So I grew up in this really unhealthy environment, and the social workers and CPS got involved shortly after I came into the world, so when I was about 2. And the abuse was just rampant at that point. So I was born into this mess. And, my mother used to, when I was growing up, and I cognitively can remember a lot of stuff from about the age of 4 and on, my mother was just in misery. She was trying to deal with this man who was abusing her, her husband who was also abusing the children. Plus she was abusing the children because they were both brought up on charges, right? And, and here she is dealing with me, a tiny little squalling baby who was sick because I came into the world ill and had to be in an incubator and everything. She did not want me, you know what I mean? So I didn't get that feeling of being wanted and cuddled and nurtured, because my mother didn't have time for that. You know what I mean? She had 5 children in the home. She had a husband who was, like I said, an abusive man who was psychologically ill. And, she was trying to deal and cope with that, as well as her own issues, because she was abused as a child, and so she was having all kinds of her own problems. And so it was just a mess, and I can't believe that that was back in the 60s. Back in those days, there wasn't a whole lot being done to help protect children. I mean, even though CPS was involved, and we used to have social workers coming in to check on us, they left us in the home because they felt that our lives were not in danger. But the thing is whether we survived or not, the abuse and the dysfunction that followed, because we were not removed from the home, killed us all anyway. 2 of my brothers committed suicide. One of my sisters was abusive to her husband and her family, right? Her life was all about control. She had to control everything. And she was also suicidal. She had a gun, and she used to go out and drive for like 3 days, and we'd wonder if she was going to come back because she had a gun, and she'd take her gun out, and we'd think maybe she was going to kill herself. And one of my other sisters goes and I think she contemplates suicide as well. So this is whether the abuse kills the child physically, or whether it kills them, their spirit and their soul. Abuse will kill a child, and that's all there is to it. And so whether they remove children from the home or not, it does kill a person inside. You know what I mean? So if they survive the abuse, They're going to be, they call it the, soul murder, the Walking Dead, right? And I mean, I talk a lot about this because that's exactly what that happened, what that did to us. You know what I mean? And that's what I recognized in myself and with my family, and that's why I decided to start speaking out, because I knew, I mean, even 4 years ago, I was still contemplating it and planning my suicide. So I mean, I made a deal. I made a commitment to myself 4 years ago that I would learn how to live instead of continuing to try to die. You know what I mean? And that's what this kind of stuff does to people. And I think that's really why I wanted to do these shows, and really why I do what I do. And it's to show the world just one more example of what abuse does, and that we have to stop it. Because children, whether they get killed or end up in the hospital due to abuse, or whether it just goes left unchecked and children are just left in the abuse, it's deadly, absolutely deadly. So whether it kills the child or the child kills themselves many years later, I mean, in some destructive manner, whether it's alcoholism, drug use, criminal activity, spending time, most people in jail, many of them have been abused. It's my siblings, most of them did prison time, and it's absolutely horrific that we should have had to suffer this. And when our parents were the ones that brought us into the world, you know what I mean? And it's like, so yes, so I mean, I do hold them accountable completely. I don't even blame CPS or DHS or any of those child protective services. I blame the abusers, because my parents made a choice. It was not CPS who was abusing us, it was my parents, and they made a choice. They were absolutely 100% guilty. They were to blame, so I blame them. You know what I mean? And I know where to put the blame. It's on the people who are actually doing the abusing. That's where the blame goes. So, absolutely horrific that people would do this to their children, but they do, right? And this is why, I mean, it's so harsh, right? So but they said even whether a child appears to be wanted in the pregnancy or not, they're still abused. If they're going to abuse the child, they're going to abuse the child. So this is just, this is sort of what this article is looking at. And they said, number 9, women who have had abortions appear to more frequently abuse and neglect children. Women who have been mistreated as children are more likely to have abortions. That's kind of interesting. I don't know. This is studies that they've done. That's just something interesting to me, because I don't know a whole lot about that. I don't really pay much attention to abortion stuff. And, I think that, my mother, like I don't know. I think that the 3 children that were born stillborn, that were between me and my sister and my brother, 2 were born before me, so there would have been 2 siblings in between me and my sister, and then another sibling in between my sister and my brother, because there was 5 years in between my sister and myself, and so my mother, and between my sister and my brother there was 2 years. So in 7 years she was pregnant 5 times and carried these children full term. So she was just pregnant all the time, you know what I'm saying? Like my mother was just always pregnant, right? And so, I think, she didn't take care of herself during those. Those were the years, prior to my arrival, when I was brought into the world, that the 2 or 3 years before that, where there was a lot of abuse, a really heavy-duty abuse in the home. And that's why my brothers were being beaten on and beaten up extremely badly by my dad, and there was just so much violence and abuse in the home before I came around and after, right? That's why CPS got involved. My dad, both my parents were busted on child abuse charges. So, I kind of think that my mother was trying to sort of abort those children, you know what I mean? Because she did not want those children. They were all born out of marital rape, out of hatred for what my dad was doing to my mother. She used to talk a lot about what she was going through, because she was manic depressive, and she was quite often sitting around at night, I hated your father and he was raping me, and we all knew this, right? I mean, as I was growing up, my dad actually raped my mother in front of me. If you guys, if everybody wants to really know the truth, and he knew I was there, and my mother knew I was there, and she was telling him, please don't do this, your daughter is right there, and he was just going to get what he wanted to get. And he didn't care, and he just, she was pushing him away and fighting him, and it was marital rape, let me tell you that. And so, my mother hated what was happening to her in her life, would not get any help, would not get out of this marriage, stuck around and kept us in the home as well, pleaded the courts, that the judge, that would allow us to stay in the home, which was really stupid. She should have just let us go. But she was desperate. She was a desperate woman who the only thing that she could think of that she had any control over in her life were her children. You know what I mean? Like she had no control over anything in her life except for her half of this deal with the children. And so even though she didn't want us, and she later on, when I was 30 years old, all through my life told me she did not want me and didn't want any of us, no children. She didn't want children. She wanted to be an artist. She didn't want this crazy marriage with her husband, my dad. And, you know, she would say this all the time. This was not something that we heard once in a while. And or when she was mad, this is just something she would tell us. And just before she died, she told us that we were all not wanted again, right? I was 28 years old, 29 years old, and the year before she passed away. And she said it again, you know, and quite frankly and quite rudely told me that we were all worthless to her, did not mean a thing, and that we were just not wanted. She didn't want children. She didn't want us, and she didn't care about us, and she hated us, and blah blah blah. She went on and on. So I told her, I said, well, what about the courts? I mean, you begged the courts, you pleaded the courts for us to stay in the home, right? And I'm like, you could have let us go, right? I'm like, I said, we have to count for something. I mean, all of us have tried to help you, to try to get you out of this marriage, you know, as adult children, you know, like some of us, the older siblings, would tell my mom, you know, let's go, we'll move out, we'll get you some help, because my parents were still very much abusive towards each other all the way through their whole marriage, right? And you know, she was just so desperate and so down. You know, she was just like, no, you guys were not worth anything to me. I said, you can't tell me that. You know, I mean, you just can't tell me that after all these years of all of us trying to make amends and trying to help you and, you know, actually loving you and caring for you, even though you were, you know, even though you did what you did to us, you know what I mean? And, you know, she said, no, you didn't count. You didn't mean anything to me, and rolled over, and that was it. You know, it was kind of interesting, you know, to hear that so many years later, that we didn't count and didn't mean anything to her, you know, when we could have been let go, right? But that's why she didn't let us go. I'm sure of it. It was to have some sort of form of control, and, you know, in a life that was, you know, completely out of her control. She was born in the 20s. My parents were born in the 1920s. They didn't, you know, there was no such thing as social assistance. You didn't get any help back in those days. You know, my grandmother was my mom's main abuser, and my grandmother murdered one of her children. never even got a slap on the wrist for it. Just buried him out in the backyard. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, you know, she was abusing orphans. She was abusing everybody. Everybody knew that my grandmother had done this to her children, that my grandmother had abused these orphans, and that my grandmother had killed one of her sons, and nothing was done, right? My grandmother was allowed to do this and get away with it. My mother grew up under this woman, you know what I mean? And so it's no wonder that she was so screwed up. But in the meantime, she used to cry the blues, and she'd sit around saying, I was abused as a child, my grandmother, you know, my mother did this and my mother did that, right? Talking to me. And I'd be like, looking at her like, well, you should know better than to treat us the way, and me the way that you treat us, you know what I mean? It's kind of, you know, it's like she lived a double standard, right? It's like, well, it wasn't okay that I was abused, but it was okay for me to do what I did to you, sort of thing. And she always justified the abuse that she put on us. She could always justify it, and, you know, in her mind, like that it was okay what she was doing to us. But in the meantime, in the back of her mind, she, you know, and crying at night, thinking she should kill herself, talking about the fact that she was so abused as a child. And so she knew it was wrong. Like, she absolutely knew what she was doing was wrong. And so, you know, I mean, my only justification really comes in the fact that I really believe that we all face judgment, and I think that she will have to, you know, at some point spiritually, you know what I mean, as we leave this earth and we move on, it will affect her, you know what I mean, because people who cognitively know what they're doing, you know, and still continue to hurt their children and hurt their families, and think they're going to get away with it. They may get away with it on this earth, but I seriously doubt they're going to get away with it, you know, in later on after they leave this earth. You know what I mean? That's just my belief. But you know, it's pretty sad. It really is that people would do this to their children. Tomorrow we're going to continue talking about this and the rest of this article, and I just want to touch on a few things, and we'll look at some more of these points that they've listed here. So you can take a look at this article, www.messengers2, messengers2.com, right? That's where this came from. And I just want to look through a few more pieces of it, and then we'll just move on for next week. But thanks for being here, everybody. Chris and Gypsy Witch, and then I had some guests here, and I just appreciate you spending the morning with me. That's awesome. So have a good day, everybody. Take care. If you can't cope and you're having a hard time, and you just think, I can't do this, you can do this. You make sure that you phone a crisis line. You phone somebody. If you don't have a friend or somebody to talk to and there's nobody around, then you phone a crisis line, but you make sure you get some help, right? Reach out and get some help, and do not allow yourself to be destroyed by this abuse, right? So, because you do matter and you do count, but you have to matter to yourself. It really came down to the fact that I when I was contemplating my suicides and planning my suicides, it really came down to the fact that I had to realize myself that my parents were never, ever going to do the right thing by me. They were never going to be able to show me any love or care, concern, and I was never going to be able to get what I needed from them, right? And so it came down to the realization that I was going to have to care about myself, and I was going to have to matter enough to myself to stay alive. And honestly, that's exactly where it is. We cannot, leave it. We cannot leave it to the past. You know what I mean? Like, ultimately, we have to matter and count to ourselves now, right? So it's so important that you do reach out and get some help, and make sure that you reach out to someone, whether it's a counselor, therapist, group support, online group support, friends, who you can trust and count on, but make sure, it's somebody who's trustworthy, right? But make sure that you do stick around and do not allow yourself to be destroyed by your past. I mean, we certainly did not deserve this, and no child ever deserves to be abused, ever, right? And it is literally up to us to fight to stay alive and to do well, to heal, to move, throughout our life, to move forward and at our own pace and what's comfortable for us, and to actually enjoy this life, because, my God, we certainly deserve it, right? So thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll talk to you later. I'll be back on tonight on Dreamcatchers Talk Radio, and as well tomorrow morning, same time, same place, one child abuse survivor to another. Have a good day, everybody. Talk to you soon.